The story of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico is one of the most tragic and complex chapters in the history of the 19th century. Born into the illustrious House of Habsburg in Austria, Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian was never intended to rule a nation, let alone a distant and troubled one across the Atlantic. However, a series of political machinations, imperial ambitions, and personal ideals led him to the throne of Mexico, a nation racked by civil war and foreign intervention. His short and ill-fated reign culminated in his execution by a Republican firing squad in 1867, making him a martyr in the eyes of some and a symbol of foreign oppression to others. This is the story of Maximilian I, the Emperor of Mexico, whose idealism and naivety led to his downfall. Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph, known simply as Maximilian, was born on July 6, 1832, in the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria. He was the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I, the ruler of the Austrian Empire. Growing up in one of Europe's most powerful and prestigious dynasties, Maximilian received an education befitting a Habsburg archduke. He was a bright and curious child, with a particular interest in the natural sciences, geography, and the arts. Despite his success in the Navy, Maximilian chafed at the constraints of his position. He was an idealist, with a deep interest in politics, culture, and the idea of governance. He traveled extensively, visiting Egypt, the Middle East, and the Americas, and he became fascinated by the idea of bringing European civilization and governance to other parts of the world. This idealism would later play a crucial role in his decision to accept the crown of Mexico. The political situation in Mexico in the mid-19th century was chaotic and unstable. After gaining independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico had been plagued by internal conflicts, foreign invasions, and economic difficulties. By the 1860s, the country was deeply divided between conservatives, who favored a centralized government and were often aligned with the Catholic Church, and liberals, who sought to establish a federal republic with a secular government. In 1861, the liberal leader Benito Juárez became president of Mexico, but his government inherited a country burdened by debt and struggling to maintain order. When Juárez suspended payments on Mexico's foreign debt, a coalition of European powers, France, Britain, and Spain, intervened militarily to protect their interests. Although Britain and Spain quickly withdrew, France, under Emperor Napoleon III, saw an opportunity to expand its influence in the Americas. Napoleon III had a grand vision of establishing a French-led Latin American empire, with Mexico as its cornerstone. To achieve this, he needed a puppet ruler who could lend legitimacy to the venture. The Mexican conservatives, eager to overturn Juárez's liberal government, supported the idea of a monarchy and began searching for a suitable candidate. Their eyes soon fell on Maximilian, who was seen as a cultured and progressive prince with strong connections to European royalty. In 1863, after much persuasion and the promise of support from both the Mexican conservatives and the French military, Maximilian was offered the throne of Mexico. Initially hesitant, Maximilian was eventually swayed by his own ideals and the belief that he could bring stability, progress, and prosperity to Mexico. He also believed that he had the support of the Mexican people, although this was largely a misconception fueled by his advisors. In April 1864, Maximilian accepted the crown, and he and his wife, Charlotte of Belgium, known as Carlota, set sail for their new empire. Maximilian and Carlota arrived in Veracruz, Mexico, in May 1864 and made their way to Mexico City, where they were formally crowned as Emperor and Empress of Mexico. At first, their reign seemed promising. Maximilian was determined to be a modern and enlightened ruler. He introduced a series of progressive reforms aimed at improving education, infrastructure, and the legal system. He also sought to protect the rights of Mexico's indigenous population, a move that won him some support among the rural poor. However, Maximilian's idealism soon ran up against the harsh realities of Mexican politics. The country was still deeply divided, and many Mexicans viewed him as a foreign usurper imposed by European powers. Despite his efforts to bridge the gap between liberals and conservatives, Maximilian found himself isolated. The conservatives, who had initially supported his reign, became disillusioned when he refused to fully restore the privileges of the Catholic Church and the landed aristocracy. The liberals, led by Benito Juárez, continued to resist his rule, seeing him as a puppet of French imperialism. Compounding these problems was the ongoing war with the Republican forces loyal to Juárez. Despite the presence of French troops, Maximilian's government struggled to maintain control of the country. The war drained the imperial treasury and led to widespread suffering among the Mexican population. As the conflict dragged on, Maximilian's support base eroded, and he became increasingly dependent on French military aid. By 1866, the situation for Maximilian had become dire. The French military, overstretched and facing mounting opposition both in Mexico and in Europe, began to withdraw its forces. Napoleon III, pressured by the United States, which had never recognized Maximilian's regime and was now emerging from its own civil war, decided to cut his losses and abandon the Mexican adventure. Without French support, Maximilian's empire was doomed. Despite pleas from his advisors and even his wife Carlota, who had traveled to Europe to seek help, Maximilian refused to abdicate. He believed that he had a duty to the Mexican people and that abandoning the throne would lead to chaos and bloodshed. In March 1867, he left Mexico City and took command of his remaining forces in the city of Querétaro, hoping to make a final stand against the advancing Republican armies. The siege of Querétaro was the last desperate attempt by Maximilian to hold on to his throne. For several weeks, his forces, outnumbered and poorly supplied, fought bravely against the Republican troops. However, the situation became increasingly hopeless as food and ammunition ran out. On May 15, 1867, Maximilian's position was betrayed by one of his officers, and he was captured by the Republican forces led by General Mariano Escobedo. After his capture, Maximilian was taken to the city of Querétaro, where he was put on trial by a military tribunal. The trial was a formality. Maximilian's fate had already been sealed. The tribunal charged him with treason against the Mexican Republic, despite the fact that he had been invited to take the throne by Mexican conservatives and had ruled as a de facto sovereign. The trial was widely criticized in Europe as unjust and politically motivated, but Juárez and his government were determined to make an example of the foreign emperor. Throughout the trial, Maximilian conducted himself with dignity and refused to plead for mercy. He defended his actions, arguing that he had accepted the throne in good faith and had sought to rule for the benefit of the Mexican people. However, his arguments fell on deaf ears, and on June 14, 1867, he was sentenced to death by firing squad. In his final days, Maximilian showed remarkable composure and courage. He wrote letters to his family and friends, expressing his love for them and his hope that his death would bring peace to Mexico. He also made arrangements for the care of his loyal followers and ensured that his last wishes would be respected. On the morning of June 19, 1867, Maximilian was led to the Cerro de las Campanas, a hill outside Querétaro where the execution was to take place. He faced his executioners with calm resolve and refused the offer of a blindfold. As he stood before the firing squad, he spoke his final words: "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood flow for the good of the country. Viva Mexico!" With that, the order was given, and Maximilian was shot by the firing squad. The once promising Emperor of Mexico, who had dreamed of bringing progress and stability to a troubled land, was dead at the age of 34. The execution of Maximilian sent shockwaves through Europe and the Americas. In Austria, his brother Emperor Franz Joseph was devastated by the loss and ordered a period of national mourning. Carlota, who had suffered a mental breakdown during her unsuccessful efforts to save her husband, was left a widow in deep grief and would spend the rest of her life in seclusion, suffering from severe mental illness. In Mexico, the fall of the Second Mexican Empire marked the end of foreign intervention and the triumph of the Republican forces. Benito Juárez, who had steadfastly resisted Maximilian's rule, restored the republic and set about rebuilding the country. However, the deep scars left,